The morning sun spilled gently across the chrome edges of Maplewood Diner, turning its windows into mirrors of gold. Usually, that light meant comfort. The smell of butter melting on pancakes, coffee brewing behind the counter, the soft chatter of regulars starting their day. But today, no amount of sunlight could erase the shadow that was about to fall inside those warm walls. At a booth near the window sat a girl in a wheelchair, her plate of pancakes resting neatly in front of her. Her name was Clara, 16, small for her age, but with a presence that seemed to carry quiet courage. Her brown hair was tucked behind her ears, and though she tried to smile at the smell of maple syrup, her trembling hands betrayed her unease. Across from her sat an empty space. She was used to that, being alone. 3 teenage boys occupied the next booth. Loud, restless, the kind of boys who thought the world was their playground. They watched Clara, whispered, laughed. Their words cut through the diner's hum like a cruel song. Clara tried to ignore them. She focused on cutting her pancakes, pretending not to notice the snickers aimed her way. But cruelty, when it decides to strike, rarely stops at words. One of the boys leaned over. "Hey, you dropped your syrup," he sneered, pretending to reach for a plate, then slapped it from her lap. The pancakes hit the floor with a wet slap, syrup splattering across the tiles. Another boy shoved her wheelchair back with his foot, just enough to make it jolt. Clara gasped, her body trembling from the sudden motion. The diner froze. The laughter of the bullies rang louder than the clatter of falling plates. Every eye turned toward them. Some people frowned. Others pretended not to notice. A mother sitting near the counter pulled her child close, whispering something under her breath. The waitress, her hands full of steaming coffee cups, hesitated in the aisle, torn between stepping in and fearing what might happen if she did. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to vanish. She wanted to believe this wasn't happening. Slowly, she bent forward, trying to pick up her ruined meal with shaking fingers, syrup sticking to her palms. The humiliation burned hotter than pain. Then, out of nowhere, a hand reached down. Not rough, not mocking, gentle. An older man with silver in his hair and kindness in his eyes bent beside her. Without a word, he picked up the plate, wiped it clean with a napkin, and placed it carefully on the table. "Don't mind them," he said softly. But his glance darted toward the boys, wary, knowing they weren't done. Clara managed a weak smile, whispering a thank you she wasn't sure he heard. The man gave her shoulder a reassuring pat before returning to his seat. His act of compassion was small, a flicker of light, but in that moment, it felt like the only warmth in the room. Still, Clara couldn't eat. The laughter from the boys continued, louder now that they had an audience. Her stomach knotted. She stared at the pancakes she no longer wanted. Around her, life went on, the clink of forks, the hiss of the griddle. But inside her chest, everything felt heavy. She thought what her mother used to tell her. Your spirit can fly even if your legs can't. But it was hard to believe that when the world seemed determined to keep her grounded in shame. As the boys kept boasting, Clara lowered her head. She prayed, not for revenge, not even for help, but for the moment to pass, for time to move faster, for her to disappear from that diner altogether. An hour crawled by. The bullies still lingered, ordering milkshakes and laughing like kings of cruelty. Some customers left quietly, unable to bear the scene. Clara stayed near the window, numb. Even the waitress avoided her eyes, perhaps out of guilt or helplessness. Then came the sound. It started as a faint rumble, low, distant, like thunder rolling through the earth. At first, no one paid attention. Then it grew louder, deeper, rhythmic. The kind of sound that made the windows tremble and conversations die mid-sentence. The waitress froze mid-step, heads turned toward the glass. In the parking lot, sunlight gleamed off metal. Dozens of motorcycles, pulling in one after another, engines growling like lions. The roar filled the air, shaking the ground beneath the diner. The boys went silent. The symbols painted on the jackets were unmistakable. Hell's Angels, their red and white insignia gleaming against black leather. They parked in a perfect line, chrome flashing, engines humming before they shut down one by one. The air outside grew still, heavy with the echo of the machines. Inside, the silence was deafening. The door swung open. The bell above it gave a single soft jingle. Then came boots. Thick, heavy measured. A tall man entered first, broad shoulders beneath a sleeveless vest covered in patches and pins. His beard was streaked with gray. His eyes, hard as steel, scanned the room in a single sweep. Behind him came several more men, their presence filling the diner with an electric tension. The bullies shrank in their booth, pale-faced now, every trace of arrogance wiped clean. The leader's gaze swept over them before softening when it landed on Clara. She froze. Her heart pounded. For a fleeting second, she wondered if he'd somehow heard what happened. If fate itself had sent this thunder and leather. The man took a slow step forward, his boots thudding against the tiles. He stopped beside Clara's table. The waitress stood rooted, unsure whether to intervene or pray. Clara looked up at him, eyes wide but unafraid. He knelt down beside her wheelchair. Up close, he didn't look like the monster people imagined. There was something deeply human behind the roughness, something protective. He studied her for a moment, then looked at the syrup-smeared floor, at the plate she'd tried to salvage. Without a word, he nodded once, as if he understood everything she couldn't say. The leader turned to face the bullies. The entire diner held its breath. The leader's gaze locked onto the boys at the booth. The air inside Maplewood Diner felt like it could shatter from the tension alone. He took a few steps toward them, his boots echoing like thunder against tile. The boys' confidence, so loud a few minutes ago, had vanished. Now, their laughter was gone, replaced by silence thick enough to choke on. The leader stopped just inches away from their table. He didn't need to shout. His presence spoke louder than any words ever could. "You think that's funny?" he asked quietly, his voice low, calm, too calm. The kind of tone that carried weight, that made even grown men listen. The boys didn't answer. Their eyes darted everywhere except toward him. One tried to mumble something about just joking, but the words collapsed halfway out his mouth. The man's expression didn't change. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if listening for something only he could hear, then leaned closer. "I've seen a lot of things in my life," he said, "but nothing lower than a man who picks on someone who can't fight back." Behind him, the other bikers spread out silently, forming a wall of leather and steel near the counter. The waitress stood frozen, her eyes wide but not with fear anymore, with awe. The customers who had stayed began to whisper, their gazes bouncing between Clara and the men who had just walked in. The leader, Roar, as one of his brothers quietly called him, straightened to his full height. He stared down at the bullies. "You've got two choices," he said evenly. "You apologize to the young lady, and you walk out here like men, or you crawl out like the cowards you are." The boys exchanged terrified glances. None of them moved. None dared speak. One finally stammered, "We didn't mean to." Roar cut him off a look sharp enough to slice through pride. "Mean to what? Make her feel less than human? Make yourselves feel big?" His words weren't loud, but every syllable carried authority, the kind that made even the toughest men shrink. Slowly, one of the boys slid out of the booth, eyes down. Then another. They turned toward Clara, their faces drained of color. "We're sorry," one of them mumbled. "We shouldn't have," his voice cracked. "We're sorry." Roar didn't move. He waited until every one of them had said the words, however weakly. Then he nodded toward the door. "Go." Outside, the row of motorcycles waited like silent sentinels. As the boys stumbled out, every biker turned their head, eyes following them until they vanished down the street. The sound of retreating sneakers was the sweetest silence the diner had ever known. When the door closed again, Roar turned back to Clara. The hardness in his face melted. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Clara nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Her eyes glistened and a small, trembling smile formed on her lips. Roar motioned for the waitress. "Bring her whatever she wants," he said, pulling out a thick wallet and setting several bills on the table. "Breakfast, lunch, dinner, it's on us. And make it with extra syrup." The waitress, blinking back tears, nodded quickly and hurried to the counter. For the first time that morning, The diner was filled not with tension, but something deeper, something healing. Then, to everyone's surprise, Roar reached up and unzipped his leather vest. It was heavy, worn, covered in patches that told stories of miles, brotherhood, and battles fought on and off the road. Carefully, he draped it across Clara's shoulders. The fabric was far too big for her, but it seemed to fit in every way that mattered. "You're family now," he said quietly. "Nobody messes with family." Clara pressed her lips together, trying not to cry, but tears rolled freely down her cheeks. Not tears of pain this time, tears of gratitude, of feeling seen. The warmth of that simple gesture thawed the icy fear that had wrapped around her heart all morning. The other bikers watched silently, nodding in quiet respect. One placed a small patch on the table beside her plate. It read, "Ride with Heart." Another handed her a keychain shaped like a winged wheel. No words, just tokens of strength passed from one soul to another. Around them, the diners began to clap, softly at first, then louder, until the room was filled with applause. Some customers wiped at their eyes. The waitress placed a fresh plate of pancakes in front of Clara, this time stacked high, butter melting on top. "On the house, too," she whispered. "You deserve better mornings." Clara smiled through her tears, looking around at the faces that once looked away. The same people who had stayed silent when she was humiliated were now clapping, some standing, their shame replaced by admiration. Even the old man who'd helped her earlier gave her a nod of pride. Roar gave her shoulder one last squeeze. "You keep that vest," he said, standing. "And when people see it, they'll know you've got brothers out there who'd ride through fire for you." Clara's voice was small, trembling. "Thank you." Roar smiled faintly. "Don't thank me, sweetheart. Just keep shining. The world's got enough darkness already." With that, he turned toward the door. One by one, the bikers followed, their boots steady, their jackets catching the morning light as they stepped outside. Moments later, the engines roared back to life, a thunderous symphony that rattled the windows but somehow filled the room with comfort instead of fear. Clara watched them through the glass, the wind lifting the edges of Roar's vest still draped over her shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she felt strong, seen, loved. The Bullies' laughter no longer echoed in her mind. What replaced it was a sound of engines fading into the distance, a promise that even in a cruel world, kindness still rode strong. The waitress leaned down beside her. "You okay, honey?" Clara nodded, smiling. I finally am." The waitress squeezed her hand. "You remember this day, okay? You remember that there's always someone who'll stand up for what's right." As the diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the air felt different, lighter, warmer, as if something sacred had passed through. People left bigger tips. Strangers held doors open. Conversations started where silence had once ruled. The world, at least in that little corner of Maplewood, had changed. And Clara, wrapped in that leather vest, knew she'd carry this day with her forever. She had learned something powerful. Cruelty can be loud, but kindness is always stronger. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show up.